looking through the literature, I'll just get rid of this continue button here for you. Oh, so I'm guessing that you see this meeting is being recorded.
We all do, yes.
Okay, hold on, let me see about how I can get rid of that. Sorry, give me a second. I'll stop sharing my screen, get rid of this, start sharing again. Here we go. Okay, back to ecosystem services. So as I said, there are many different definitions of ecosystem services, and the one that I prefer to use is the diverse benefits that nature provides to people. Another way to think about this concept is the different contributions that nature makes to people. And freshwaters and the landscapes that they're connected to provide many ecosystem services. They can be an important source of food. They are places that many people love to go spend time recreating. Here in Canada, paddling is one of our famous recreational activities on freshwaters. They play a role in flood regulation. They provide drinking water that we all rely on. They are places where we can go to experience a spiritual connection to a landscape. This is a picture of a young man named Hunter Sugarhead, who I worked with in Northern Ontario a few years back. They also store carbon and thereby contribute to global climate regulation. And when we place infrastructure on them, they can even become places that generate electricity. And so as you can see through these examples, the concept of ecosystem services is a very broad one. In my view, one of the biggest benefits of this concept is that it truly tries to create space to push us to simultaneously think about the many different ways that people interact with ecosystems. And I firmly believe that by thinking about all those different types of interactions that people have with different ecosystems across different scales and trying to account for them as best as possible while making decisions is key to shifting toward a more sustainable and equitable future. There's a little short story that I want to share about this to help illustrate what I mean. So some of you may be familiar with the Site C project. It's a large dam that was put into place here in Canada in British Columbia. And I read a report related to this project about when biologists were asked to figure out how to minimize the impacts of this dam. With their training, the biologists thought about maintaining the flow of the river in a key location to preserve fish populations, and then they worked with engineers to propose certain target areas to help make that possible, all the while generating electricity. Later, local First Nations were horrified at the propositions they made. Why? Because the proposition involved flooding an important spiritual rock. And to me, when I think about a social ecological context, or this particular social ecological context, that rock is a type of ecosystem services. Now, had biologists leaned on the ecosystem service concept when deciding what to include in their models, they would have been more likely to speak to people, including local First Nations, so they could understand all the different services provided by the region and consider them in their models, which would have been a good thing when it comes to making a truly informed decision about the long-term sustainability and equitability of a development project like the Site C Dam. And so again, what I like about this concept is that I think it's a truly holistic and adaptable framework to help researchers, practitioners, and other people think about how ecosystems contribute to and interact with human well-being. And that makes it a very promising avenue to help inform ecosystem management. But for the ecosystem service concept to inform management, researchers and practitioners need to be able to evaluate services. Now, when I say evaluate, I don't necessarily mean putting a biophysical or monetary value on a service. Quantifying a service can also mean collecting information about how people perceive services, if they care about them or how they use them. And being able to assess and quantify ecosystem services is an essential step toward being able to talk about them among different actors, compare management options in a systematic way, and use information about ecosystem services to help make these informed decisions. And now, Research in this growing field of ecosystem services has shown us that there are some key considerations that need to be made when conducting ecosystem service evaluations if you want the concept to effectively be able to inform management and decision making. And so I thought that to start us off today, I would highlight 3 of those, as I think that they're the most essential ones to help you understand what factors really need to be thought about when you decide that you want to lean on this ecosystem service concept. So the first is the identification of the diverse ecosystem services at play on a landscape that's being assessed. Ensuring that there's no bias in the types of services considered in any ecosystem service evaluation is fundamental to being able to use the results to inform equitable and sustainable management. And one really important thing to keep in mind when it comes to biases is perspective. People are tied to ecosystem service well-being outcomes. So including their knowledge, perceptions, and different perspectives into ecosystem service identification and quantification can help to identify relevant services and then choose appropriate management methods. Next, we need to make sure we understand and quantify interactions among ecosystem services, or in other words, trade-offs and synergies that happen between different services. This is really important because management focused on a single service can lead to unintended consequences on other services. So take, for example, management strategies that solely focus on increasing agricultural yield of a field. Today, after many years of research, we understand that this can lead to an unintended consequence, like a decrease in the availability of high quality water because of runoff from this field into surrounding streams and rivers and lakes. We also understand that this could lead to diminished access to rivers that people consider interesting for recreational activities, for example. And this example is a very intuitive type or are very intuitive types of interactions. But interactions occur between all kinds of different services. And if we really want to utilize the potential benefits of the ecosystem service concept, we need to be thinking about how different services interact and taking those interactions into account as we make management decisions. It's also key to understand the diverse spatial and temporal scales at which ecosystem services are provided, because managing services at mismatched scales can lead to undesired consequences. And I think freshwaters are a truly fantastic example of how scale misalignment can happen when it comes to management because of the hydrological connectivity in freshwater systems. So this connectivity means that something like an industrial waste spill that happens in a river can influence that system hundreds of kilometers away. And so when we're thinking about ecosystem services, it's important to ask ourselves questions about at what scale are these services produced, at what scale are they consumed, and then at what scale do we consequently manage them. Now, properly making each of these considerations in a single research study would be, of course, extremely methodologically challenging, very time consuming, and perhaps not always necessary depending on the ecosystem service question that you want to ask. But keeping these considerations in mind as you think about how you might want to use the ecosystem service concept to better understand freshwaters is really important. And it's especially important if you intend to use your results to help inform management. So if you want to learn more about these key considerations and freshwaters, and specifically in riverine contexts, I invite you to go take a look at a review that I published as part of my PhD research, in which I explored how the literature is doing in terms of addressing these key considerations and provide recommendations for how to implement those recommendations in riverine systems, or those considerations in riverine systems. And so this article has an example, it points to a number of other articles that have done a good job at doing this and helps provide some good guidelines on quantifying ecosystem services in riverine habitats. So now that what I mean by ecosystem services is clear, and you have a sense of some important factors that should be considered when evaluating services, I want to spend the rest of the time that we have together today sharing some examples of how I've used the ecosystem service concept to better understand the outcomes of different management strategies on freshwater services, as well as come up with ideas for improved management strategies in freshwater systems. Now, one of the management strategies that I've especially been interested in over the past years is protection. What I mean by protection is defined geographical spaces that are recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature. And currently, formally protected areas of this sort cover 15.2% of global terrestrial areas and inland waters. And that number is actually expected to double in the next 10 years in countries like Canada, where our Prime Minister recently signed on to protect 30% of Canada's inland waters and terrestrial areas by 2030. Now, historically, many protected areas have been put into place specifically to conserve biodiversity or extraordinary natural features. But still today, there's an increasing expectation that they will also contribute to the provision of ecosystem services. And this is made clear through targets like the Aichi Target 11, which explicitly uses the term ecosystem services when it talks about the desired outcomes of protected areas. But the thing is, when you look at the literature, it turns out that we don't actually know that much about how protection affects the provision of services, especially when it comes to freshwater services. And knowing that is really important when it comes to deciding how and where protected area expansion should take place. Now, personally, I'm very hopeful that this expansion will specifically take freshwaters into consideration, because historically protected freshwaters have been really neglected in the establishment of protected areas. And I think that thinking about ecosystem services as we make those decisions can help us lean on how to protect freshwaters in particular. And so one of the questions that I work to answer with my research is, what are the effects of watershed, land use, cover, and protection on stream and riparian zone biodiversity and ecosystem services? This is a publication that came out in Conservation Biology last year, and I'm excited to tell you about it because land use is changing around the world. Development is increasing, forests are being cut down or turned into agricultural fields, protected areas are being degazetted. And as this happens, we need to understand the impact of protection versus other land use management strategies on freshwater ecosystem service provision and biodiversity. I think this is really key to making informed decisions and avoiding these unanticipated consequences of land use change on freshwater ecosystem service provision. And so to answer this question, I decided to conduct field surveys. I'll show you a short video about what that kind of looked like. So in this study, we quantified 5 different ecosystem services. We looked at carbon stored in riparian zones, as well as different edible foods found in stream riparian zones. We quantified water quality of streams. We looked at recreational trails. And we also looked at habitat quality. To complement that, we looked at indicators of biodiversity, both aquatic and terrestrial. And we did this work in 28 different streams that were surrounded by 4 different types of land use or protection status. So first, we visited streams that had unprotected watersheds surrounded by forestry. Then we visited streams surrounded by agriculture. We visited unprotected streams surrounded by forest, and streams surrounded by national parks, which are essentially protected forests, here in the province of Quebec in Canada. And our objective was to determine the impact of protection on ecosystem services. And so to summarize that with figures, we visited 7 different national parks in the province of Quebec that you see on this map. And for each of those national parks, we visited 4 different but comparable streams that had watersheds that were mainly occupied by these 4 types of land use or protection statuses. And so watersheds surrounded by national parks, unprotected forests, unprotected agricultural land use, and unprotected timber harvesting or forestry. And then at each of those sites, we sampled a 100-meter segment of a stream to collect information about ecosystem services, as well as 4 different plots in the riparian zone of that stream. And there we collected information about these 5 different ecosystem services. Of course, there are many other ecosystem services that are provided by streams and their riparian zones, but we chose to focus on these because there are services that came up as important in a nature survey that was done across Canadians in 2012. And also they were services that we could practically quantify in the field. And so what did we find? Well, one of our main objectives in this study was to evaluate the overall impact of watershed protection on the amount and quality of ecosystem services and biodiversity. And so we put all of our data together, split it up by these 4 different watershed types, and then scaled and centered it so it would be comparable. And then we put it into a statistical model called a permanova, which allows us to compare the overall amount and quality of ecosystem services and biodiversity across these 4 watershed types. So I'll show you a few figures now to visualize the findings of this analysis. This circle is showing the average amount of ecosystem services and biodiversity that we documented in streams surrounded by national parks. So each of the different colored triangles in the circle shows a different ecosystem service or biodiversity indicator that we measured in the field. And again, the data was scaled and centered and when necessary inversed so that it would be comparable. And the main thing that I want you to pay attention to here is the amount of color that you see. So more color means more ecosystem services and biodiversity. Now, let's compare this to the data that we collected in and around streams surrounded by unprotected forests. There are small differences here, but overall, there's a pretty similar amount of color. What about streams surrounded by forestry? Less color for a number of different indicators. And streams surrounded by agriculture? Again, less color than in streams surrounded by national parks and unprotected forests. And so we clearly see differences here, but I want to overlay the results of the permanova analysis on this figure to show you what the statistics say. So now I've added letters to the top corner of each of these circles. And circles with the same letter are not statistically different from each other. Circles with different letters are. So this means that streams in national parks and streams surrounded by unprotected forest provide a similar amount and quality of ecosystem services and biodiversity, or this set of ecosystem services and biodiversity. Whereas streams embedded in production landscapes where there's forestry or agriculture provide a different amount of this set of ecosystem services and biodiversity. And to me, what this figure is really saying is that watershed protection can indeed help ensure the consistent provision of a high quantity and quality of a certain set of ecosystem services and biodiversity. And because we compared protected streams to unprotected ones that had similar land use, and we didn't find a significant difference between them, we're able to confirm that the differences that we see are at least in part driven by changes in land use. And this finding really helps shed light on one of the mechanisms that's driving differences in ecosystem service provision between protected and unprotected areas. It tells us that protection affects this particular set of services in this way because of the effect that it has on preventing land use from changing from forest to agriculture or forestry. Now, shifting gears, another important thing that you can notice in this figure is the impact of land use is not the same across all of these different indicators of ecosystem services and biodiversity. Some are more affected by forestry, whereas others are more affected by agriculture, and some don't really seem to be that affected at all by changes in land use. And in this research, we really wanted to understand these differences. So we also separately looked at the effects of watershed type on individual ecosystem service and biodiversity indicators using a mixed model approach. Now, I unfortunately don't have time to walk you through all of these findings today, but I will show you an example of these results and some of the interesting interactions that they reveal. So this is a figure showing the data that we collected on habitat quality and how it differs from one watershed type to the next. These are box plots, so they show the full range of the data distribution, and the horizontal line in the middle of the boxes is the median value documented. So a higher habitat quality score means a better habitat quality. And what we see here is that only streams surrounded by agriculture had a significantly lower habitat quality than protected streams. But what does that statistical difference really mean? Well, if we compare this to provincial norms about what these habitat quality scores indicate, we see that the difference matters biologically because all of the agricultural sites that we visited had what the government considers to be a marginal habitat quality, which can result in impacts on wildlife, or almost all, to the exception of one. So why is habitat quality so consistently low in streams surrounded by agriculture? Why is there such a large difference between streams in protected and unprotected ones? And the answer is more complex than agriculture impacts habitat quality. It's also about the laws that govern land use management in agricultural contexts. So in Quebec, the law says that 10 meters of all riparian zones are not allowed any sort of development except in agricultural zones where only 3 meters are restricted from development. And this difference in regulation results in less stable vegetation in the 10-meter riparian zones of agricultural areas. It results in unstable banks and more sedimentation, which all negatively impact habitat quality. And I wanted to point this out because it shows us that it's not just about protection. The laws that govern land use outside of protected areas can also have an important impact on freshwater ecosystem service provision. And this law doesn't only impact habitat quality. Agricultural riparian zones don't store as much carbon in trees as other riparian zones because they don't have that many trees. On the other hand, the riparian zones have lots of raspberries because they don't have trees. And so this shows us that there's kind of a trade-off here. Another interesting thing is that our data suggests that when these riparian zones do have trees, they tend to have some of the most biodiverse species assemblages of trees. So this shows us that there's room for policies to protect stream and riparian zone ecosystem services and biodiversity in production landscapes, because these can also thrive there. But their ability to thrive will really depend on how land use is managed. And so by making this decision to only protect 3 meters of agricultural riparian zones, we end up with consequences on ecosystem services. So I hope this example has helped you to start thinking about the nuances of our findings in this work and how biodiversity and different ecosystem services interact with land use management, policies, and between each other. To me, the main takeaway from this study is that protecting watersheds can help ensure the continued supply of a high quantity and quality of biodiversity in a number of ecosystem services. And we also learned that changes in watershed land use come with certain trade-offs. No surprise, but still important to document. I think we need to be considering those trade-offs when we make land use management decisions, when we degazette a protected area because we need timber or food, or even when we decide that we're going to put a new protected area into place. My hope is that practitioners are going to be able to turn to this type of research and pick it up to gain a better understanding of the role of watershed protection that it can play or does play or could play in the landscapes that they manage. And through this type of work, research on ecosystem services can help anticipate the diverse effects of our land planning decisions, the trade-offs that result for them, and perhaps even come up with mitigation measures. And so to me, this is a neat example of how the ecosystem service concept can be used to help eventually inform management. The next project I want to tell you about is also about protected areas and ecosystem services. But instead of asking how do protected areas contribute to the provision of ecosystem services, in this project, I wanted to ask how the ecosystem service concept and information about ecosystem services can help inform protected area management. So this project took place in a region just west of Ottawa, where various municipalities have been working for years to try and establish a park in the zone surrounded by a red box on this map. That is, so it's a region along the Outaouais River, a major river here in Canada. But the thing is, when these organizations first tried to establish a park, there was a lot of controversy. They had hired a private consulting firm to design the park, and the vision that this firm came up with wasn't at all in line with what locals wanted, and so the project eventually failed. Today, there's a local grassroots conservation organization called the Friends of the Shaw Falls that are still interested in gaining protection status for this park or parts of it that aren't currently protected. But they know that that needs to happen a different way to their previous efforts. Another organization that works in this region is the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And colleagues of mine from there started to wonder if the ecosystem service concept may be able to help inform how those next steps could best happen. So in 2016, they put me in touch with the Friends of the Shaw Falls. And after chatting with the director of the Friends of the Shaw Falls, I thought that part of the conflict that came up when the municipalities had previously tried to put a park into place might have to do with differences between desired and provided ecosystem services. Let me quickly explain what I mean. Landscapes provide people with ecosystem services, or in other words, they allow services to flow from nature to people. And that flow reflects the provision of services, or in other words, the actual amount of services that people benefit from. Now, if the provision of services and the demand for services are equal, my guess is that we end up in a situation where people are happy with the relationship that they have with the landscape, and they don't really envision it being used or managed in a different way. And so conflict is unlikely in these contexts. However, if ecosystem service provision and demand are different to each other, this can happen for a number of reasons. People are not going to be happy with the relationships that they share with the landscape. And this has strong potential to lead to conflict. And in the community that I was working with the Friends of the Shaw Falls, it turns out that people were quite concerned about putting a protected area into place because they thought it might affect their ability to meet their demand for ecosystem services. Specifically, they thought that if the area was designated as a park, they'd no longer be able to fish or use their ATVs. But establishing a park doesn't necessarily mean losing access to these types of ecosystem services. It can in fact mean gaining better access. Establishing a park can provide the opportunity to figure out what local demand for ecosystem services is, see if there are discrepancies between demand and provision for services, and if there are, figure out if there are management actions that can be taken to improve service provision. And so all this led me to work on a project in the region the Friends of the Shaw Falls works in, focused on identifying pathways to reduce discrepancies between desired and provided ecosystem services. To do this, we worked with a team of stakeholder engagement and ecosystem service experts to collaboratively develop a novel three-part process. So the first part involved using a survey to identify services that local felt they benefit from in the region, services that they would ideally like to benefit from in certain quantities and qualities but don't, and actions that they thought could be taken to improve service provision. The second part involved facilitating a participatory workshop with members of the community to collectively identify plausible actions that could be taken to improve local service provision and discuss potential trade-offs that might result from those actions. I'll show you a short video to give you a better idea of what this looked like. So participants arrived at this workshop that took place in the community the park was scheduled to be in, and they settled down in groups of 4 or 5, accompanied by a table host or a facilitator. I then spent some time setting the stage for the day, explaining what we were there for. And these groups of 4 or 5 then went into their first dialogue, which was all about, why are you dissatisfied with ecosystem services in this region? Then facilitators kept notes during these different discussions, and in turn reported back to the entire group so that everyone would have an idea of what was happening at the different tables. We then moved into our second group dialogue, which was all about generating ideas for how to address these dissatisfactions in terms of ecosystem service provision. And then as a full group, we discussed specific actions that could be taken and if there were any concerns related to those specific actions. Following this, I was able to move into the third step of our process, for which I compiled all the ideas that were generated from the workshop and the survey into a report that outlined actions that community members came up with and that they felt could be taken to improve local service provision, as well as any potential trade-offs associated to those actions. And so this report was then shared with the Friends of the Shaw Falls and other relevant stakeholders, as well as local community members that were interested in using the results to help guide the next management actions that they would take in the region. This included deciding how to best manage the area that they hope to eventually turn into a park. I'm running short on time here, so I'll just quickly skim through this. One of the key parts of this report focused on using thematic content analysis to assess the links between the reasons why different individuals or groups were dissatisfied with service provision. So this is shown here in blue and in orange. And then what I did is I linked all of those different reasons to related proposed actions that community members came up with. So this is shown in green and yellow and the other shade of blue. And this is an example of one of these figures. It's extremely complicated. So I mean, there's a lot going on actually, so I won't walk you through it. But the key point here is that one of our overall findings was that using this process that we developed, community members identified plausible actions that could be taken to reduce most of the discrepancies between the ecosystem services that they felt were adequately provided in their communities and those of which they'd like to see different quantities and qualities of. And so what this tells me is that this process is constructive and could be picked up in other regions as a tool to help co-determine how people benefit from ecosystem service provision and what actions can be taken to improve that service provision. And I think this process can be especially useful in the context of existing protected areas where there are conflicts because of insatisfactions related to ecosystem service provision, or in contexts where new protected areas are going to be put into place and managers need to make decisions about what types of service provision will and won't be allowed or fostered within their boundaries of the protected areas. And so historically, these types of management decisions have often been made without input from local communities, but changing that can help avoid conflicts, sometimes associated to assigning formal protection status to areas. And I think this is especially interesting for freshwater systems, where I'm hoping that as we move forward to try and protect an ambitious additional amount of Canada's land, we start to really consider freshwaters and consider the connectivity between freshwaters and surrounding landscapes. So that is the connectivity between freshwaters and people and the social ecological systems in which freshwaters are embedded. So together, I hope the work that I've shared with you today has given you a better idea of what exactly freshwater ecosystem services are, how they can be evaluated, and how their evaluation can help us better understand the implications of different management strategies, as well as implement more effective management strategies that lead to win-win solutions for diverse actors. I'll finish there for now. Thank you to all the co-authors, help and research partners and funding sources that have made this work possible. And I think now we'll move into our question period / panel discussion. I'm very excited to be here today with Irina and Kate, who have a ton of experience in this field and surely will have lots to share on the topic.
Many thanks for a great talk, super interesting. Just a reminder that I will stop the recording right now, and the